The wind howled across the barren plains like a wounded animal, carrying with it the endless dust that had become Sarah Mackenzie's constant companion. She stood in the doorway of her weathered cabin, watching the sun bleed crimson across the western horizon. 3 years had passed since Thomas died, yet the ache in her chest remained as raw as the day she'd found his body riddled with bullet holes, victim to outlaws who'd taken everything except her life in this patch of unforgiving land. At 27, Sarah had already lived through more hardship than most women twice her age. Her calloused hands gripped the rough wooden frame as she surveyed her meager domain, a small corral with 2 horses, a vegetable garden struggling against the drought, and the vast emptiness stretching endlessly in every direction. The nearest town, Bitter Creek, lay 15 miles east, a journey she made only when absolutely necessary. The isolation pressed upon her like a physical weight. Days merged into weeks, with only the howling coyotes and occasional hawk's cry breaking the oppressive silence. She'd grown accustomed to talking to herself, to the horses, even to Thomas's grave on the small hill behind the cabin. Anything to hear a human voice, even if it was only her own. As darkness crept across the land, Sarah retreated inside to prepare her simple supper, cornbread and beans, the same meal she'd eaten countless times before. The cabin, built by Thomas's own hands, consisted of a single room with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed, and shelves lined with preserves she'd put up during better times. Every corner held memories of their brief marriage, the rocking chair he'd carved for her, the quilt her mother had sent from Missouri, the rifle he'd taught her to shoot hanging above the mantel. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Sarah glanced toward the window. Storm clouds gathered like dark sentinels on the horizon, promising the rain the parched earth desperately needed. She finished her meal in the flickering lamplight, then stepped outside to secure the shutters and check on the horses. The first fat drops of rain began to fall as she entered the small barn. Her mare, Buttercup, nickered softly in greeting while the old gelding, Moses, dozed in his stall. Sarah ran her hand along Buttercup's neck, finding comfort in the animal's warmth. "Storm coming, girl," she murmured. "Best we all hunker down for the night." Lightning split the sky, illuminating the landscape in a harsh, white brilliance. In that brief moment of clarity, Sarah caught sight of something that made her heart skip, a dark shape near the edge of the corral. Too large to be a tumbleweed, too still to be an animal seeking shelter. She reached for the pitchfork leaning against the wall, every muscle tensing. Living alone had taught her caution. Too many dangers lurked in the darkness. Wolves, bandits, drifters with bad intentions. Moving carefully, she crept toward the barn door, peering through the growing downpour. Another flash of lightning revealed the truth. A man lay crumpled against the fence post, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. Even from this distance, she could see the dark stains spreading across his chest, mixing with the rain to form crimson puddles in the dirt. Sarah's first instinct was to retreat, to bar the doors and wait for morning. But as she studied the figure, she noticed details that gave her pause. Long black hair plastered against copper skin, buckskin leggings torn and muddy, a beaded belt that marked him unmistakably as Comanche. Her hand tightened on the pitchfork as conflicting emotions warred within her chest. The Comanche had been enemies of the settlers for as long as anyone could remember. Stories of raids and massacres circulated through every town and trading post. Some said it was Comanche warriors who'd attacked the wagon train where her cousin Mary had died 5 years ago. Yet looking at this broken figure in the mud, Sarah saw not a fearsome warrior but a wounded human being, perhaps dying, certainly alone. The Christian teachings of her childhood whispered in her mind, "Love thy neighbor. Show mercy to the afflicted." But stronger still was the memory of Thomas, always kind to strangers, always willing to share their meager provisions with travelers. What would he have done? Thunder crashed directly overhead, making her decision for her. Whatever this man had done, whatever his people had done, she couldn't leave him to die in the storm like an animal. Moving quickly now, Sarah set aside the pitchfork and ventured into the rain. The warrior was heavier than he looked, dead weight in her arms as she struggled to drag him toward the cabin. His skin burned with fever despite the cold rain, and fresh blood seeped through her fingers where she gripped his shoulders. Twice she slipped in the mud, nearly dropping him, but determination drove her forward. Rather than take him into the cabin proper, that seemed too dangerous, too intimate. Sarah remembered the root cellar. Dug into the hillside behind the cabin, it stayed cool in summer and warm enough in winter, with a heavy door that could be barred from outside. If the warrior proved dangerous when he woke, she could contain him there. By the time she managed to maneuver him down the wooden steps, Sarah was soaked to the skin and trembling with exhaustion. She lit the oil lamp kept there, casting shadows across shelves of preserved vegetables and sacks of grain. In the flickering light, she got her first clear look at her unexpected guest. He appeared younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 years, with sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw marked by old scars. 3 bullet wounds marred his chest and shoulder, not fresh, but recent enough that infection had clearly set in. His breathing came shallow and labored, each exhale rattling in his chest. Sarah had learned basic doctoring from her mother and had tended Thomas through illness and injury. She fetched clean water, whiskey from Thomas's hidden stash, and torn strips of fabric from old petticoats, working by lamplight. She cleaned the wounds as best she could, picking out bits of fabric and what might have been bone fragments. The warrior never stirred, lost in fever dreams that had him muttering in a language she couldn't understand. As she worked, Sarah found herself studying his face, noting the differences and similarities to the men she'd known. His features were handsome in their own way, proud even in unconsciousness. Intricate scars marked his arms, purposeful scarification that told stories she couldn't read. A leather pouch hung from his neck, which she carefully avoided disturbing, sensing its sacred nature. By the time she finished, dawn light filtered through the cracks in the cellar door. Exhaustion weighed on her like a physical burden, but she forced herself to think clearly. If anyone discovered she was harboring a Comanche warrior, the consequences would be severe. At best, she'd be ostracized from the community that already barely tolerated a woman living alone. At worst, she'd heard stories of vigilante justice against Indian lovers. Sarah spread a horse blanket over the unconscious man and left water within reach should he wake. Then she climbed the steps, barred the door, and stumbled to her own bed. As she drifted toward sleep, she wondered what madness had possessed her. In saving this stranger's life, had she sealed her own fate? The last thing she remembered was the sound of rain against the roof and the weight of the choice she'd made, a choice that would change everything in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Sarah woke to the sound of crashing from the root cellar. Her heart hammered as she grabbed Thomas's rifle from above the mantel, checking that it was loaded before creeping toward the back of the cabin. Through the small window, she could see the cellar door straining against its bar, shuddering with each impact from within. The warrior had awakened. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, Sarah approached the cellar. She stood to one side of the door, rifle ready, and called out, "I know you're awake. I'm going to open this door, but if you try anything, I'll shoot. Understand?" The banging stopped. Silence stretched between them, broken only by her rapid breathing and the morning songs of meadowlarks. Slowly, Sarah lifted the bar and stepped back, weapon trained on the entrance. The door creaked open, and the Comanche warrior emerged into daylight like a wounded panther, cautious, alert, ready to fight despite his injuries. His dark eyes swept the surroundings before fixing on her with an intensity that made her finger tighten on the trigger. Fresh blood seeped through the bandages she'd applied, evidence of his struggle to escape. For a long moment, they regarded each other, predator and prey, though Sarah couldn't say which was which. The warrior's gaze traveled from her face to the rifle to the cabin behind her, calculating. When he took a step forward, she raised the weapon higher. "Stop right there," she commanded, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. He froze, then slowly raised one hand to his chest, wincing at the movement. His lips moved, forming words in his own language that she couldn't understand. The confusion in his expression seemed genuine. He clearly had no idea where he was or how he'd gotten there. "You were shot," Sarah said, speaking slowly as if that might bridge the language barrier. "I found you in the storm, by my fence." She gestured toward the corral, then at his bandaged wounds. "I helped you." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed quickly by suspicion. His free hand moved toward his waist, searching for weapons that were no longer there. Sarah had removed his knife and tomahawk while treating him, hiding them in the barn. "Easy," she said. "I'm not going to hurt you unless you force me to." The warrior's legs trembled, and he swayed on his feet. The brief burst of adrenaline that had fueled his escape attempt was fading, leaving him weak and disoriented. He reached for the doorframe to steady himself, pride warring with necessity on his face. Sarah lowered the rifle slightly. "You need food and rest, more medicine for those wounds." She pointed toward the cabin. "Can you walk?" He straightened, drawing on some inner reserve of strength, and took a tentative step forward, then another. Sarah backed away, maintaining distance between them as they made their way to the cabin. At the threshold, the warrior hesitated, clearly uncomfortable entering an enemy's dwelling. "It's all right," Sarah said, though she wondered if she was reassuring him or herself. "Inside." She gestured to the chair by the fireplace while keeping the rifle within reach. The warrior sat gingerly, his movements careful and controlled. In the morning light streaming through the windows, she could see the toll his injuries had taken: hollow cheeks, fever-bright eyes, the slight tremor in his hands. Sarah ladled water from the bucket by the stove, offering it to him at arm's length. He accepted it with a slight nod, drinking deeply. When he finished, he set the cup aside and spoke again, a string of words that sounded like a question. "I don't understand," Sarah said, shaking her head. Frustration flashed across his features. He pointed to himself, then made a sweeping gesture that seemed to encompass the world outside. A question about his people, perhaps, or where he was. "You're about 15 miles from Bitter Creek," she said, knowing he wouldn't understand but needing to fill the silence. "Your people, I don't know where they are. You were alone when I found you." The warrior's shoulders sagged slightly at her tone, even if the words meant nothing to him. He touched his bandaged chest, then pointed at her, his expression shifting to something that might have been gratitude. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Don't thank me yet. I haven't decided what to do with you." She busied herself at the stove, warming leftover beans and cornbread. The domestic activity felt surreal with a Comanche warrior sitting in Thomas's chair, but she needed time to think. The rational part of her mind screamed that she should ride to town, alert the sheriff. But another part, the part that had dragged him through the storm, whispered that turning him in would be tantamount to murder. When she set the plate before him, the warrior ate slowly, with dignity despite his obvious hunger. Sarah noticed his hands, strong and calloused like her own, but with long fingers that moved with unexpected grace, without the paint and fierce expression of war. He looked almost ordinary, human. A knock at the door shattered the strange peace. Sarah's blood turned to ice as a familiar voice called out, "Mrs. Mackenzie, you in there?" Jim Patterson from the neighboring ranch, 5 miles north. He stopped by occasionally to check on her, more out of nosiness than genuine concern. Sarah grabbed the warrior's arm, pointing urgently toward the bedroom. "Hide!" she hissed. "Quickly!" Whether he understood the word or simply read the panic in her face, the warrior moved with surprising speed. Ducking into the small bedroom, Sarah straightened her dress, tucked loose hair behind her ears, and opened the door with what she hoped was a natural smile. "Morning, Jim. What brings you out this way?" Patterson stood on her porch, a wiry man with suspicious eyes and tobacco-stained teeth. "Saw the storm last night. Wanted to make sure you weathered it all right." His gaze swept past her into the cabin. "You alone?" "Of course I'm alone. When am I not?" Sarah kept her tone light, though her heart raced. "Just asking. There's been trouble stirring. Comanche raiding party hit the Miller's place 2 days back, stole horses, burned their barn. Colonel says they wounded one of the savages before they escaped. Whole town's up in arms about it. Sarah gripped the door frame to steady herself. How terrible for the Millers. Were they hurt? Miller got an arrow in his shoulder. But he'll live, unlike those red devils when we catch them. Patterson spat tobacco juice off the porch. You seen anything unusual? Tracks, maybe? Nothing. Just the storm. His eyes narrowed. You sure? You look a mite peaked. I didn't sleep well. The thunder kept me awake. Patterson studied her for a long moment. Sarah forced herself to meet his gaze steadily, knowing any sign of nervousness would increase his suspicion. Finally, he nodded. Well, you be careful. Lock your doors at night. A woman alone. He let the implied threat hang in the air. Maybe you ought to consider moving to town. This ain't no life for a decent woman. I manage fine. Jim, thank you for your concern. After he left, Sarah sagged against the closed door, trembling. The warrior emerged from the bedroom, his expression questioning. She pointed toward the window where Patterson's horse was disappearing into the distance. That was too close, she muttered. This is madness. I must be out of my mind. The warrior said something in his language, his tone suggesting he understood the danger his presence brought. He moved toward the door, clearly intending to leave, but stumbled after only a few steps. Fresh blood spotted his bandages. No, Sarah said firmly. You'll die out there in your condition, and then they'll track you back here anyway. She guided him back to the chair, then fetched her medical supplies. As she worked to change his dressings, the warrior sat perfectly still, watching her with those dark, unreadable eyes. This close, she could smell the mixture of herbs and smoke that clung to his hair, could see the intricate tattoos that decorated his arms. I don't even know your name, she said softly, more to herself than to him. The warrior touched his chest and spoke a single word that sounded like ahiga. Then he pointed at her, raising an eyebrow in question. Sarah, she said. My name is Sarah. He repeated it, the syllables foreign on his tongue. Sarah. It was the first moment of real communication between them, fragile as a soap bubble. Sarah found herself almost smiling before reality crashed back. Outside, the sun climbed higher, marking another day in which she harbored an enemy of her people, another day of lies and danger. Yet, as she finished tending his wounds and their eyes met across the small space of her cabin, Sarah realized she'd already crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Whatever happened next, she'd chosen her path the moment she dragged him in from the storm. The question now was whether they'd both survive the consequences of her mercy. Days passed in an uneasy rhythm. Each morning, Sarah would check Ahiga's wounds, noting with relief as the angry red inflammation gradually faded. The fever broke on the third night, leaving him weak but lucid. Though they couldn't speak each other's language, they developed a system of gestures and expressions that allowed basic communication, despite his injuries. Ahiga insisted on helping with small tasks. Sarah would find him mending the fence with scraps of wire, his movements careful but determined. One afternoon, she discovered he'd repaired the loose boards on the porch, work she'd been putting off for months. When she tried to protest, he simply pointed to the food she'd given him, then to the completed work, as if settling a debt. The sight of him splitting firewood in the dying light of evening stirred something in Sarah she didn't want to examine too closely. It had been so long since she'd seen a man's silhouette against her doorway, heard footsteps that weren't her own crossing the floor. She told herself it was just the loneliness talking, nothing more. Ahiga seemed to understand the danger his presence brought. During the day, he stayed alert, ducking out of sight at the slightest sound of approaching horses. At night, he insisted on sleeping in the barn, though Sarah had offered him the cabin floor. She suspected it was partly caution and partly propriety, his own culture's rules about unmarried men and women. One morning, Sarah woke to find a freshly killed rabbit hanging from her porch beam, cleaned and ready for cooking. Ahiga sat on the steps, using her whetstone to sharpen a makeshift spear he'd crafted. When he saw her, He gestured from the rabbit to the horizon, indicating he'd hunted it at dawn. "You shouldn't go out," she said, though she knew he wouldn't understand the words. "It's too dangerous." He seemed to grasp her concern, touching his chest and making a motion that suggested strength returning. Indeed, he moved with more of his natural grace now, the warrior showing through the wounded man. As Sarah prepared the rabbit for stew, she watched him from the corner of her eye. He was sketching something in the dirt with a stick. Mountains, she realized, and a river, a map. He pointed to various spots, then to himself, clearly trying to show her where his people might be. "Your family," she said softly. "You want to go home?" The longing in his eyes needed no translation. Sarah felt an unexpected pang at the thought of him leaving. These past days, despite the constant fear of discovery, had been less lonely than the past 3 years. Having someone to cook for, to care for, had awakened parts of herself she'd thought died with Thomas. That evening, as they shared the rabbit stew, a dust cloud on the horizon made them both tense. Riders, moving fast. Ahiga was on his feet instantly, ready to flee. But Sarah grabbed his arm. "Wait," she said. "Let me see who it is first." She climbed to the roof using the ladder Thomas had built for repairs, shading her eyes against the setting sun. 3 riders, still too far to identify, but as they drew closer, her heart sank. Sheriff Watson's distinctive black hat was unmistakable. Sarah scrambled down, urgently gesturing for Ahiga to hide. He understood immediately, gathering his few possessions and slipping into the root cellar. Sarah barely had time to hide the extra plate and arrange herself on the porch with her mending before the riders arrived. "Evening, Mrs. Mackenzie." Sheriff Watson tipped his hat. He was a fair man, generally, but his expression was grim. With him were 2 deputies Sarah recognized but didn't know well. "Sheriff, what brings you all the way out here?" "Looking for a wounded Comanche. Jim Patterson said you hadn't seen anything, but we're checking every homestead." "Mind if we look around?" Sarah's mouth went dry. "Of course not. Though I can't imagine why a wounded man would come here." "Desperate men do desperate things," Watson said, dismounting. "This particular savage killed 2 soldiers before they put bullets in him. Very dangerous." The deputies spread out, one heading to the barn while the others circled the cabin. Sarah forced herself to remain calm, continuing her mending with steady hands. Watson stood nearby, his eyes scanning the property. "Living alone agrees with you," he observed. "Place looks well kept. I manage. Still, a woman alone. Have you given any thought to remarrying? Plenty of men in town would be interested." Sarah kept her eyes on her needlework. "I'm not ready for that. Sheriff?" The deputy emerged from the barn. "Nothing in there but horses and feed." The other returned from behind the cabin, pausing near the cellar door. Sarah's heart nearly stopped, but he merely glanced at it before shaking his head at the sheriff. "Guess Patterson was right," Watson said, mounting his horse. "Still, you be careful. If you see anything, tracks, smoke, anything unusual, you ride to town immediately. Understood?" "Yes, Sheriff." After they left, Sarah waited a full hour before releasing Ahiga from the cellar. He emerged covered in dust and cobwebs, but his eyes held a new wariness. He spoke rapidly in his own language, gesturing toward the horizon. She didn't need to understand the words to know what he was saying. His presence put her in terrible danger. That night, Sarah lay awake listening to the wind. Through her window, she could see the barn where Ahiga slept. She thought about Sheriff Watson's words. Killed 2 soldiers. Could it be true? The man who carefully mended her fence and hunted to contribute to their meals didn't seem like a killer. But then, what did she really know about him? The next morning brought an answer of sorts. Sarah found Ahiga sitting by Thomas's grave on the hill, having discovered it during his dawn hunt. When she approached, he pointed to the simple wooden cross, then to her, his expression questioning. "My husband," she said, touching her chest. "Dead 3 years now." Ahiga studied her face, then placed his hand over his heart and spoke several words in his language. Though she couldn't understand them, the tone was unmistakably one of sympathy. He gestured to himself, then made a cutting motion across his throat, followed by pointing to the ground. His wife was dead too. They sat in silence on the hillside as the sun climbed higher, two souls marked by loss, finding an unexpected kinship that transcended words. Sarah pulled up a handful of prairie grass, letting it scatter in the wind. Ahiga watched, then did the same, some shared ritual of grief that needed no explanation. When they returned to the cabin, something had shifted between them. The wariness remained, but underneath lay a deeper understanding. They were both survivors, both carrying scars that would never fully heal. That afternoon, Ahiga began teaching her simple words in his language: water, food, danger. She reciprocated with English, amused by his careful pronunciation. When he finally managed "thank you" clearly, his rare smile transformed his face completely. As evening approached, Sarah noticed him favoring his injured shoulder more than usual. The day's activities had strained his still-healing wounds. She insisted on checking the bandages, finding them spotted with fresh blood. "You're pushing too hard," she scolded, knowing he wouldn't understand but needing to voice her concern. As she worked, Ahiga sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on some point beyond her shoulder. Sarah became acutely aware of his presence, the warmth radiating from his skin, the controlled breathing, the way the lamplight played across the planes of his face. Her hands trembled slightly as she secured the fresh bandage. When she finished, their eyes met. Something electric passed between them, a recognition of possibility that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Ahiga reached up slowly, his fingers barely grazing her hand where it rested on his shoulder. The touch was light as a butterfly wing, but it sent shivers through her entire body. Sarah pulled away, stepping back so quickly she nearly knocked over the medical supplies. I need to start supper," she stammered. Ahiga lowered his hand, his expression unreadable, but as Sarah busied herself at the stove, she could feel his eyes following her movements. The cabin suddenly felt too small, too warm, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. That night, she heard him pacing in the barn, restless as a caged wolf. Sarah understood the feeling. Everything was changing, becoming complicated in ways that went far beyond the simple danger of harboring a fugitive. She pressed her face into Thomas's pillow, but for the first time in 3 years, she couldn't summon his face clearly. Instead, she saw dark eyes filled with understanding, strong hands gentle with her wounded fence, a rare smile that made her heart race, and she knew, with a certainty that frightened her, that regardless of what the sheriff had said, she was already in far deeper than she could afford to be. The town of Bitter Creek buzzed with renewed fear and anger. Sarah heard the news from Martha Williams, who stopped by unexpectedly with her husband Earl to deliver troubling updates. 2 more homesteads had been raided, though whether by Comanche or opportunistic outlaws claiming to be Indians, no one could say for certain. "You really shouldn't be out here alone," Martha insisted, her pinched face full of disapproval. "It's not proper, and now with these savages running wild." Sarah gripped her coffee cup tighter. "I appreciate your concern, Martha, but I'm quite safe." Earl Williams stood by the window, his sharp eyes scanning the property. "Awful lot of firewood split for one woman," he observed. "You hire someone to help?" "I manage on my own," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Ahiga had wisely hidden at the first sound of approaching wagon wheels, but evidence of his presence was everywhere if one looked closely enough. "Well, you always were stubborn," Martha sniffed. "Just like Thomas, God rest his soul. He should have sold this place and moved you to town where it's civilized." After they left, Sarah found her hands shaking as she cleared the cups. The walls were closing in. Every visitor brought fresh danger, every conversation a minefield of potential exposure. That evening, as she and Ahiga shared their simple meal, she noticed him watching her with unusual intensity. He'd picked up enough English to understand basic concepts, and she suspected he'd grasped more of the Williamses' visit than she'd like. "Danger," he said quietly, one of the first English words she'd taught him. He pointed to himself, then made a sweeping gesture toward the door. "I go. No." The word came out sharper than she intended. "You're still healing. You wouldn't make it 5 miles before—" She stopped, unable to voice what they both knew would happen if he were caught. Ahiga reached across the small table, his fingers barely brushing hers. "Sarah, safe," he said carefully. "I go." The selflessness of it, his willingness to face certain death rather than endanger her further, brought tears to her eyes. "We'll be careful," she insisted. "Just a little longer." That night brought the first real cold snap of autumn. Sarah woke shivering, despite the quilts piled on her bed. Through chattering teeth, she remembered the barn had gaps in the walls that let in the wind. Ahiga must be freezing. She wrapped herself in Thomas's old coat and ventured outside with extra blankets. The barn was pitch black, but she could hear Ahiga's teeth chattering in the darkness. "This is foolish," she muttered, lighting the lantern. He was curled on the hay, trying to preserve warmth. "Come inside. You'll catch your death out here." He shook his head, but she saw him shivering. His injuries had left him weakened, less able to withstand the cold. Sarah made an exasperated sound and thrust the blankets at him. "Stubborn man," she said, though her tone was fond rather than angry. As she turned to leave, a violent coughing fit seized him. The harsh, wet sound sent alarm through her. She'd heard that cough before, when Thomas had taken ill that last winter before the outlaws came. Pneumonia could kill as surely as any bullet. "That's it," she declared. "I won't have you dying in my barn. Come inside, now." Whether he understood her words or simply recognized the command in her tone, Ahiga followed her to the cabin. She pointed to the floor near the fireplace, layering blankets to create a pallet. He hesitated at the threshold, clearly uncomfortable with the arrangement, but another coughing fit decided him. Sarah stoked the fire until it blazed, then prepared a tea of willow bark and honey, her mother's remedy for lung ailments. Ahiga drank it without complaint, though she saw him grimace at the bitter taste. As the warmth seeped into the cabin, his shivering gradually subsided. "Sleep," she told him, pointing to the makeshift bed. She retreated to her own room but left the door cracked open, listening to his breathing. The cough continued intermittently, each episode making her wince. Near midnight, she heard him speaking in his own language, fever dreams taking hold, unable to stand it. Sarah crept into the main room. Ahiga thrashed on his pallet, sweat beading his forehead despite the chills that racked his body. She knelt beside him, pressing a cool cloth to his burning skin. His eyes flew open at her touch, wide and unfocused. He spoke rapidly in Comanche, reaching for something that wasn't there. Sarah caught his hand, holding it firmly. "Shh," she soothed. "You're safe. Rest now." He stared at her for a long moment, recognition slowly returning. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Yes, I'm here." His fingers tightened around hers, and he spoke again, a name she didn't recognize, repeated several times with increasing urgency. Then, in broken English, "If I die, remember, Dakota, my name, spirit. You're not going to die," Sarah said firmly, though fear clawed at her chest. "I won't let you." He managed a weak smile. Stubborn woman, despite her worry. Sarah found herself smiling back. "Yes, well, you're stuck with me." Through the long night, she tended him, cooling his fever, helping him sip water, listening to the rambling mixture of English and Comanche that poured out in his delirium. She learned fragments of his story: a wife lost to soldiers' bullets, a young son who died of white man's disease, the endless cycle of violence that had driven him to become a warrior. Near dawn, the fever finally broke. Ahiga's breathing eased, the terrible cough quieting. Sarah, exhausted, had dozed off sitting beside him, her hands still clasped in his. She woke to find him watching her, his dark eyes clear and fully aware. The morning light streaming through the window caught the silver threads in his hair, made the lean planes of his face seem softer somehow. You stayed, he said quietly. Of course I stayed. Something shifted in his expression, a deepening of the gratitude that had always been there, transformed into something warmer, more dangerous. He lifted their joined hands, studying them as if they held some answer he'd been seeking. Why? The question encompassed so much. Why had she saved him? Why did she risk everything? Why did she care whether he lived or died? Sarah found she had no answer that made sense, even to herself. Instead, she squeezed his hand gently. Rest. You need to rebuild your strength. But as she tried to pull away, Ahiga held on. Sarah, he said, pronouncing her name correctly for the first time. My people, they say the spirits tie souls together, across worlds, across enemies. He struggled for the English words. You and I, tied now. The intensity in his voice made her tremble. She understood what he was saying, felt the truth of it in her bones. Whatever had begun as simple Christian mercy had evolved into something that defied explanation. They were bound together now, for better or worse. A sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. Sarah's blood turned to ice as Jim Patterson's voice called out. Mrs. Mackenzie, open up. I saw smoke from 2 fires last night. You hiding someone in there? Ahiga was already moving, heading for the bedroom despite his weakness. Sarah smoothed her hair, trying to calm her racing heart. The pallet by the fireplace told its own story. She grabbed the blankets, shoving them behind the wood box. Coming, she called, buying precious seconds. When she opened the door, Patterson stood there with 2 other men she didn't recognize. Their faces were hard, suspicious, hands resting on their gun belts. Morning, Jim, she said, affecting surprise. What's all this about? Don't play dumb, woman. Someone saw a figure moving around your place at dawn yesterday. Indian, by the look of him. Sarah forced a laugh. An Indian? Here? That's absurd. Is it? Patterson pushed past her into the cabin, his companions following. Then you won't mind if we look around. They searched with ruthless efficiency, overturning furniture, pawing through her belongings. Sarah stood frozen, knowing that any protest would only increase suspicion. When one man headed toward the bedroom, her heart nearly stopped. The crash of breaking pottery drew their attention. Her mother's china plate, one of her few treasures, lay shattered on the floor. The man shrugged apologetically, but his eyes held cruel satisfaction. They found nothing in the bedroom. Ahiga had somehow vanished, though Sarah couldn't imagine where. The root cellar was checked. The barn searched again, finally, frustrated and angry. The men gathered in her yard. Maybe we were wrong, one said. Maybe it was just shadows. Patterson spat tobacco juice. Maybe, or maybe she's hiding him somewhere we can't find. Wouldn't be the first time a lonely widow took up with a savage. The insinuation in his voice made Sarah's cheeks burn, but she kept her expression neutral. I think you should leave now. We'll leave when we're ready. Patterson sneered. But mark my words, if we find out you've been harboring that murdering redskin, there won't be enough left of either of you to bury. After they finally rode away, Sarah collapsed against the door frame, shaking. Ahiga emerged from wherever he'd hidden, behind the false panel in the wall where Thomas used to store valuables. She realized. His face was grim, understanding all too clearly what had just transpired. Now I go, he said firmly. No more danger for you. But Sarah saw the way he swayed on his feet, the lingering effects of his illness. She thought of Patterson's threats, the hate in those men's eyes. Ahiga wouldn't last a day in his condition, not with half the territory hunting for him. No, she said, surprised by her own vehemence. We'll find another way. The look he gave her then, mixed admiration and sorrow, nearly broke her heart. He understood, perhaps better than she did, that they had passed the point of no return. Whatever happened now, their fates were intertwined, as if to seal that fate. He spoke the name again. Dakota. Then, pointing to her, you carry this name now too. In here. He touched his chest, over his heart. If they come, if I die, You tell them. Sarah Dakota. They understand. She didn't fully grasp what he was offering, what it meant to share a Comanche name, but she felt the weight of it, the sacred trust being placed in her hands. In that moment, standing in a ransacked cabin with danger closing in from all sides, Sarah made her choice. Then we'd better make sure neither of us dies, she said. The sound of approaching horses sent Sarah's heart racing. She'd been hanging laundry when the dust cloud appeared on the horizon, too many riders to be casual visitors. Ahiga materialized beside her like a shadow, having heard them too. Soldiers, he said quietly, his English improving daily. Many. Sarah's mouth went dry. A full cavalry patrol could mean only one thing. They were conducting a systematic search. The root cellar, she said urgently. Go now. But Ahiga shook his head, pointing to the horses in the corral. Among them stood his paint horse, which Sarah had found wandering near the creek 3 days ago. She'd been foolish to keep it, but the animal had been injured and she couldn't bear to leave it to die. They know, Ahiga said simply. My horse, they know. The riders were close enough now to make out details, blue uniforms, rifles across their saddles. Sarah counted at least 8 men, led by a captain with severe features and cold eyes. Get inside, she hissed. Let me handle this. For once, Ahiga didn't argue. He slipped into the cabin while Sarah forced herself to continue hanging clothes, as if military patrols were an everyday occurrence at her homestead. Mrs. Mackenzie. The captain dismounted, touching his hat brim perfunctorily. Captain Morrison, 3rd Cavalry. We're investigating reports of Comanche activity in this area. I haven't seen any Indians. Captain, Sarah said, pleased that her voice remained steady. Morrison's eyes swept the property, lingering on the corral. That's interesting, ma'am, because that paint horse there matches the description of one stolen from Fort Dodge 2 months ago. Mount belonging to a Comanche warrior who killed 2 of my men. Sarah's mind raced. I found that horse wandering near the creek. It was injured. I assumed it belonged to a traveler who'd met with misfortune. Did you now? Morrison's tone suggested he didn't believe a word. Men, search the premises. The soldiers dismounted with practiced efficiency. Sarah watched helplessly as they swarmed over her property. 2 men entered the barn. Others circled the cabin. Morrison himself strode toward the front door. Captain, I must protest. Stand aside, ma'am. The search was thorough and destructive. They overturned her furniture, emptied drawers, knocked over preserve jars that shattered on the floor. Sarah bit her lip to keep from crying out as they destroyed her home with methodical precision. Sir, a young soldier emerged from the barn. Found Comanche gear hidden in the hay, beaded belt, medicine pouch. Morrison's expression hardened. Where is he, Mrs. Mackenzie? I don't know what you mean. The captain backhanded her so suddenly she didn't see it coming. Sarah fell to her knees, tasting blood where her teeth had cut her lip. I'll ask once more. Where is the savage? There's no one here but me. Sarah gasped. Morrison grabbed her arm, hauling her upright. Private Johnson, check the root cellar. Private Mills, that shed by the garden. Find him. As soldiers scattered to follow orders, Sarah's terror mounted. They would find Ahiga. There was nowhere left to hide. She thought desperately of the name he'd shared with her, wondered if she'd have the chance to speak it before they killed him. A shout from behind the cabin made her heart sink. They'd found him, but instead of gunfire, she heard scuffling, curses, then an eerie silence. Report, Morrison barked. Private Johnson stumbled into view, blood streaming from his nose. He was in the cellar. Sir, fought like a wildcat. Williams is down, might be dead. The Indian fled toward the ravine. Morrison cursed viciously. After him, dead or alive. I want that savage. Most of the soldiers mounted up and rode hard toward the ravine. Morrison remained with 2 men, his grip still cruel on Sarah's arm. You harbored an enemy of the United States, he said coldly. That's treason. Mrs. Mackenzie. He was wounded, Sarah said, lifting her chin despite her fear. I couldn't leave him to die. Couldn't you? That savage tortured and killed good men, women too, most likely. And you nursed him back to health? Morrison's face twisted with disgust. You're worse than him. At least he's following his nature. You're a traitor to your own kind. The sound of gunfire echoed from the ravine, multiple rifles firing rapidly. Sarah closed her eyes. Each shot a knife to her heart. Ahiga was outnumbered, probably still weak from his illness. He didn't stand a chance. Appears your pet Indian is putting up a fight, Morrison observed. No matter, we'll run him down like the dog he is. More gunfire. Then silence. Sarah waited, hardly breathing, for the soldiers to return with Ahiga's body. Instead, a single rider approached. Private Johnson again, his face pale. Captain, Williams is dead for certain. Collins took an arrow to the shoulder. The Indian, he got away. What? Morrison released Sarah to grab the private's jacket. How did one wounded savage escape 8 armed soldiers? He knows the terrain. Sir, led us into a box canyon, then somehow scaled the cliff face. By the time we'd found another way up, he was gone. Simpson's tracking him, but... Morrison shoved the soldier away, then rounded on Sarah. This isn't over. You'll answer for your crimes. Woman. What crimes? Sarah found her voice. Anger overcoming fear. Showing Christian mercy? Since when is that against the law? Since you chose to show it to a murdering savage instead of your own people. Morrison gestured to his men. Burn it down. No! Sarah lunged forward, but a soldier caught her, holding her back. Please, this is all I have. You should have thought of that before you took up with that redskin. They were efficient in their destruction. Her cabin, built by Thomas's own hands, went up in flames. The barn followed, though they freed the horses first. Small mercy. Sarah watched 3 years of solitary struggle turn to smoke and ash, tears streaming down her face. Consider yourself fortunate, Morrison said as they prepared to leave. In another time, we'd hang you for what you've done. As it is, you're destitute and marked. No decent person will help you now. They took Ahiga's horse as evidence, leaving Sarah with only Buttercup and Moses. As the cavalry disappeared into the distance, she stood alone among the ruins of her life, smoke stinging her eyes. But she was alive, and somewhere out there, Ahiga was too. As the sun began to set, painting the sky the color of blood and flame, Sarah made a decision. She loaded what few possessions had survived onto Moses, saddled Buttercup, and turned her back on the ashes of her old life. She remembered Ahiga's map drawn in the dirt, the mountains and river he'd shown her. It was dangerous, a white woman traveling alone into Comanche territory. But what did she have left to lose? Before mounting up, she spoke aloud to the emptiness. My name is Sarah Dakota. The words felt strange on her tongue, but also right somehow. And I'm going to find him. The first stars were appearing as she rode west, leaving the burning remnants of her homestead behind. She didn't know what lay ahead, whether she'd find Ahiga, whether his people would accept her, whether she'd survive the journey. But as Buttercup picked her way carefully in the gathering darkness, Sarah felt an unexpected lightness. The life she'd clung to out of duty and fear was gone. In its place was something terrifying and exhilarating. Freedom. Somewhere in these vast plains, a wounded warrior was making his own journey. Sarah touched the medicine bundle she'd saved from the barn, the one item of his she'd managed to hide from the soldiers. It was warm against her chest, like a promise. Dakota, she whispered to the night wind. The name meant friend to all in Lakota. Ahiga had managed to explain. She wondered if it would be enough to save her when she found his people, if she found them behind her. The last of the smoke dissipated into the star-filled sky. Ahead lay only darkness and possibility. Sarah Mackenzie was dead, burned away with her cabin. In her place rode someone new, a woman who'd chosen love over safety, compassion over convention. She didn't know if she was riding toward death or a new life. But for the first time since Thomas died, she felt truly alive, and that, she decided, was worth any risk. The night swallowed her up, just another shadow moving across the endless prairie, carrying a Comanche name and a heart full of desperate hope. 3 days into her journey, Sarah's water ran low. The landscape had shifted from familiar prairie to rougher terrain, rocky outcroppings, deeper ravines, stands of juniper that could hide any manner of danger. She'd seen no sign of Ahiga, though she'd followed the path he'd sketched in the dirt as best she could remember. On the fourth morning, she woke to find 3 Comanche warriors watching her from a nearby ridge. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She sat up slowly in her bedroll, keeping her hands visible. The warriors made no move to approach, simply observing her with expressions she couldn't read. One of them, younger than the others, said something to his companions and gestured toward her. "Dakota!" Sarah called out, her voice cracking with thirst and fear. "I carry the name Dakota!" The warriors exchanged glances. The eldest, a man with silver threading through his braids, rode closer. His eyes swept over her travel-worn appearance, lingering on the medicine bundle visible at her throat. He spoke in Comanche, the words flowing too quickly for her to catch any meaning. When she shook her head, he switched to broken English. "Where you get this?" He pointed to the medicine bundle. "From Ahiga," she said. "He gave me the name Dakota. He's hurt. Soldiers shot him." Recognition flickered across the elder's face at Ahiga's name. He spoke rapidly to the others, then turned back to her. "You come." It wasn't a request. Sarah packed her bedroll with shaking hands and mounted Buttercup. The warriors flanked her, not threatening but clearly ensuring she couldn't flee. They rode in silence for hours, deeper into territory no white person was meant to see. The Comanche camp appeared suddenly in a hidden valley, tipis arranged in neat circles, smoke rising from cooking fires, children playing between the lodges. Activity stopped as they entered. Women paused in their work. Men emerged from tipis, all staring at the white woman in their midst. The elder warrior led her to a teepee set slightly apart from the others. He dismounted and called out. The flap opened, and Sarah's heart stopped. Ahiga stood there, thinner than before, but alive. His eyes widened in shock. Then something else, fear, anger? She couldn't tell. "Sarah," he breathed. "Why? Why you come?" Before she could answer, a woman emerged from the teepee behind him. Young, beautiful, with a baby on her hip. She looked at Sarah with suspicious eyes, then spoke sharply to Ahiga in Comanche. Understanding hit Sarah like a physical blow. He had a family here, a wife, a child. Everything he'd shared with her. Had it all been lies? Ahiga saw her expression and stepped forward quickly. "No, you don't understand. She is my brother's widow. She cares for me, but she is not—" He struggled for the English words. "In my heart, there is only—" He didn't finish, but his eyes said what his words couldn't. The woman, his sister-in-law. Sarah now understood, looked between them and made a disgusted sound before retreating into the teepee. The elder warrior spoke at length with Ahiga, gesturing toward Sarah frequently. She caught her name, both Sarah and Dakota, multiple times. Ahiga's responses grew increasingly heated, until finally the elder held up his hand for silence. "You bring trouble," the elder said to Sarah in his careful English. "Soldiers follow." "No," Sarah said firmly. "I was careful. I left no trail." "White woman always leaves trail," he said grimly. But he studied the medicine bundle at her throat again, seeming to weigh something in his mind. "Ahiga says you saved him, says you lost your home for him. It was the right thing to do." The elder made a sound that might have been approval or skepticism. "You stay tonight, tomorrow. Council decides." Sarah was given a place in a teepee with an elderly woman who spoke no English but showed her kindness through gestures. As night fell, she sat by the central fire, acutely aware of the stares and whispers surrounding her. Some faces showed curiosity, others open hostility. She was the enemy here, regardless of the name she carried. Ahiga appeared as the stars emerged, sitting carefully beside her. In the firelight, she could see new scars on his arms, wounds from his escape that had healed poorly without proper care. "You shouldn't have come," he said quietly. "This is no place for you. Neither was my burned cabin." Sarah replied, "At least here I'm with—" She stopped, uncertain how to finish. With you seemed too forward, too presumptuous, given what she'd learned. The woman, Yellowbird, she wants me to take her as wife, Ahiga said, as if reading her thoughts. My brother's widow should not be alone. It is our way, but I cannot. Why not? He turned to look at her fully. You know why. The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. Around them, the camp continued its evening routines. Children being called to bed, men gathering to smoke and talk, women banking fires. Normal life, except for the white woman and the warrior who'd upended both their worlds. The council will not be easy, Ahiga warned. Some want to trade you to the Mexicans. Others say kill you before you bring soldiers. Only a few listen when I tell them what you did. And what do you want? He was quiet for a long moment. I want many things I cannot have. I want my first wife alive, my son laughing. I want the buffalo to return and the white men to vanish like smoke. He paused. I want you safe, but safe is not here. Safe isn't anywhere for me now, Sarah said. I made my choice when I dragged you in from the storm. That was mercy. This is, what, foolishness? Madness? Love, he said simply. And love between us is death sentence. The word hung between them like a living thing. Sarah had known, of course, had felt it growing despite every rational reason to resist. But hearing him speak it aloud made it real, undeniable. Then why give me your name? She asked. Why tell me about Dakota if you didn't want me to find you? Because I was dying, he admitted. Fever dreams. I wanted someone to remember, to speak my true name to the spirits. I didn't think that I'd be fool enough to use it, despite everything. He smiled, that rare expression that transformed his face. Brave enough. You are the bravest woman I know. Sarah Dakota. A commotion near the camp's edge interrupted them. Riders arriving fast. Voices raised in alarm. Ahiga was on his feet instantly, hand reaching for the knife at his belt. The scouts brought dire news. Soldier sign, moving along the eastern ridge. A large force, perhaps following Sarah's trail after all. The camp erupted into controlled chaos. Weapons gathered, horses saddled, women packing essential items. The elder warrior from before strode over, his face grim. You bring death to us. I'm sorry, Sarah began, but he cut her off with a gesture. Council meets now. No time for proper ceremony. He looked at Ahiga. You speak for her? Yes. Then her fate is your fate. Choose quick. As the emergency council convened, Sarah stood in the circle of firelight, feeling the weight of dozens of lives hanging on whatever happened next. She'd fled here seeking Ahiga, seeking some kind of future different from the ash and loneliness she'd left behind. Instead, she'd brought danger to his people, forced choices that had no good answers. The hostile faces around the fire told her what many thought. She should be killed or abandoned to save the tribe. But Ahiga stood beside her, translating the rapid discussion. His presence the only thing between her and disaster. When called upon, he spoke passionately in his own language, gesturing toward her, toward the east where danger approached. Finally, the elder raised his hand. The council had decided. He spoke at length in Comanche, then turned to Sarah. You carry Dakota name. This is sacred thing, not given lightly. Ahiga says you earned it with blood and sacrifice. Says you are woman of two worlds now. He paused, studying her face. We do not abandon family, but family must share our fate. You ride with us, fight with us if needed, die with us if that is what spirits demand. You accept? Sarah looked at Ahiga, saw the mixture of hope and fear in his eyes. Then she faced the council. I accept. The elder nodded. Then we run. Soldiers want Ahiga, want you. We give them long chase. Maybe they give up, maybe not, but we are Comanche. We know how to disappear. As the camp dissolved around them with practiced efficiency, Ahiga touched her arm. Are you certain? This life, it's nothing like what you knew. Nothing like the life I lost. Sarah corrected. But maybe like the life I was meant to find. In the distance, the faint glow of campfires marked the approaching soldiers. By dawn, they would find only cold ashes and tracks leading in 6 different directions. The Comanche had survived centuries by adaptation, by knowing when to fight and when to fade into the landscape like ghosts. Now Sarah would learn to be a ghost too, carrying a name that bound her to people who had every reason to hate her kind. It was terrifying. It was impossible. It was the only choice that felt like living. The thunder of approaching hooves shattered the pre-dawn quiet. Sarah jolted awake to find the camp already dissolving around her, tipis falling like dying flowers, families scattering into the darkness. Ahiga burst into the teepee where she'd been sleeping, his face grim. "They found us! Move now!" Sarah grabbed her few possessions. Following him into chaos, warriors mounted horses bareback, women tied children to their backs, elderly clutched what treasures they could carry. The efficiency was heartbreaking. A people so used to running they could vanish in minutes. "Stay close," Ahiga commanded, boosting her onto Buttercup before vaulting onto his own mount. "Whatever happens, don't stop." The first shots cracked through the air as they fled the valley. Sarah looked back to see blue uniforms cresting the ridge, cavalry charging down like an avalanche. Screams pierced the night. Someone had been hit. The band split into smaller groups as planned, scattering in different directions. Sarah's group, about 20 souls including children, rode hard toward a narrow canyon Ahiga had pointed out days before. Behind them, gunfire echoed off the rocks like thunder. A woman riding beside Sarah suddenly arched her back, crimson blooming across her doe-skin dress. She toppled from her horse, her infant's cries cutting through the chaos. Without thinking, Sarah wheeled Buttercup around. "No!" Ahiga shouted, but Sarah was already dismounting, scooping up the wailing baby as bullets whined overhead. The mother was dead, eyes staring at the lightening sky. Sarah remounted clumsily, clutching the child, and spurred Buttercup forward. They made the canyon just as the sun painted the rocks blood red. The narrow passage forced their pursuers to slow, buying precious time. But as they emerged on the far side, Sarah's heart sank. More soldiers waited in the open ground ahead. They'd been herded into a trap. "Circle up!" the elder warrior's command rang out. The group formed a defensive position among a cluster of boulders, women and children in the center, warriors facing outward. They were outnumbered 3-1. Ahiga pressed a rifle into Sarah's hands. "You remember what I taught you?" She nodded, though her hands shook. During their flight, he'd shown her basic shooting, hoping she'd never need it. Now, cradling another woman's baby with one arm and gripping the weapon with the other, she understood the weight of her choice to carry the name Dakota. Captain Morrison rode forward under a white flag, and Sarah's blood chilled. Of course it would be him, the man who'd burned her home, who'd sworn to see her hang for treason. "I know you're in there, Mrs. Mackenzie," he called out. "Or should I say, the white squaw. Come out now, and I might show mercy." Ahiga started to respond, but Sarah stood up behind their makeshift barricade. "What mercy? Captain, the kind you showed my cabin?" Morrison's face darkened at seeing her among the Comanche. "You've chosen your side? Then so be it." He raised his hand to signal attack, then paused. "Oh, and that savage you're so fond of? He killed 2 more of my men during our chase. That's 4 good soldiers dead because of your misguided sympathies. Your soldiers died because they hunted innocent people." Sarah shot back. "Because they burned and pillaged and—" Morrison's signal cut her off. The attack came from 3 sides at once. The battle was fierce and desperate. Sarah had never imagined such violence. The screams of horses and humans, the acrid smoke of gunpowder, the copper smell of blood. She fired when blue uniforms appeared in her sights, trying not to think about the young faces beneath those caps. Beside her, Ahiga fought with deadly precision, but they were vastly outnumbered. A warrior named Swift Eagle fell, then another. The elder who'd accepted her into the band took a bullet to the chest, his wife's keening wail rising above the gunfire. Children huddled against their mothers, some already orphaned in the span of minutes. "We can't hold," Ahiga said grimly, blood running from a graze on his temple. They'll overrun us soon. Sarah looked at the baby in her arms. A girl, maybe 6 months old, with dark eyes wide with terror but trusting. Around them, the remnants of the band fought hopelessly. This wasn't how the stories went. There was supposed to be escape, a clever trick, something, but real life offered no such mercies. Ahiga, she said quietly. That name you gave me, Dakota, does it truly make me family? Yes, in the eyes of my people, you are one of us now. Then I'll die as one of you. He caught her face between his hands, heedless of the battle raging around them. No, you live, take the child, ride north, find the main band. Tell them. A bullet caught him in the side, spinning him to the ground. Sarah screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. Blood poured between his fingers as he pressed against the wound. Go, he gasped. Save her, save yourself. But Sarah was done running. She'd fled from grief after Thomas died, fled from loneliness, fled from her burning home. No more. Together, she said firmly, tearing strips from her skirt to bind his wound. We go together or not at all. The soldiers were closing in, their circle tightening. Only a handful of warriors still stood. Morrison rode at their head, his face triumphant. This was his moment of victory, crushing the savage threat and the traitor who'd aided them. That's when Sarah remembered the medicine bundle at her throat. Ahiga had told her once, during their flight, that it contained sacred items, including poison extracted from desert plants, meant for warriors who refused to be taken alive. She met Ahiga's eyes, saw understanding dawn there. He shook his head weakly. No, not for you. My choice, she said softly. I chose this when I chose you. But as she reached for the bundle, a new sound cut through the battle. War cries from beyond the eastern ridge, the main Comanche war band, drawn by the gunfire, crested the hill like an avenging flood. Fresh warriors, mounted and painted for battle, crashed into the soldiers' rear guard. The tide turned in moments. Soldiers who'd been advancing now wheeled to face this new threat. Morrison screamed orders, trying to reform his lines, but the Comanche fought like devils or like people defending their families. In the chaos, Sarah half carried, half dragged Ahiga to where horses still stood. Others were doing the same, gathering wounded, mounting children. The baby still clung to her, silent now, as if understanding the need. They fled again, but this time with the war band covering their retreat. Sarah looked back once to see Morrison surrounded, still fighting, still screaming his hatred at enemies who refused to be conquered. Miles later, when they finally stopped, Sarah counted their losses. Of 20 souls, only 12 remained. The elder was dead, along with 6 warriors and 2 women, the baby's mother among them. Ahiga lived, though barely. The war band's medicine man worked over him with herbs and chants, while Sarah held his hand, her own prayers mixing with Comanche words she'd learned. You should have run, Ahiga whispered through his pain. And missed the chance to save your stubborn life again? Sarah managed a weak smile. Besides, someone has to raise this little one. Can't do it alone. He squeezed her fingers. The council, they'll accept you now. You shed blood for the people, carried a child through battle. You're not white woman anymore. You're Nemini, the people. As if in agreement, the baby made a small sound against Sarah's chest, looking down at the tiny face. Sarah felt something shift inside her. This child had no one now, just like Sarah had had no one, but together. What was her mother's name? She asked the woman tending nearby, wounded. Morning Star, good woman, good mother. Then that's what we'll call her, Sarah decided. So she carries her mother's memory. The war band moved them that night, deeper into hidden territories where soldiers couldn't follow. Sarah rode with Morning Star secured against her chest and Ahiga strapped to a travois, drifting in and out of consciousness. As dawn broke over a new camp in a secret valley, Sarah realized her old life wasn't just gone. It had been burned away completely. Sarah Mackenzie, the grieving widow, the woman who'd followed rules and lived in fear, was dead as surely as if Morrison's bullets had found her. In her place sat Sarah Dakota, mother to an orphaned child, partner to a wounded warrior, member of a hunted people. The transformation was complete, sealed in blood and fire and desperate choices. She thought it should feel like loss. Instead, as Morningstar stirred awake and reached tiny fingers toward her face, it felt like coming home. The hidden valley stretched before them like a promised land, green grass fed by a natural spring, protective cliffs on 3 sides, and a narrow entrance that could be easily defended. After weeks of running, the band had found sanctuary, at least temporarily. Sarah stood at the edge of their new camp. Morningstar balanced on her hip, watching Ahiga teach young boys to fletch arrows. His wound had healed slowly but cleanly, leaving another scar to join his collection. In the golden afternoon light, she could almost forget they were fugitives. "You look at him like Coyote looks at Moon," said Singing Dove, the medicine man's wife who'd become Sarah's closest friend among the women. "Like you want something you can never catch." Sarah smiled ruefully. "We're together. That's enough." "Is it?" Singing Dove's knowing look said she understood more than Sarah had voiced. They'd been in the valley 2 months now, and while Sarah was accepted, even respected after the battle, certain boundaries remained. She and Ahiga shared the work of raising Morningstar, shared meals and conversation, but nothing more. "In the white world, I was a widow," Sarah said quietly. "Here, I don't know what I am." "You are woman between worlds." Singing Dove said, "This is hard path, but look." She gestured to where Morningstar reached for a butterfly, laughing. "Some beautiful things only grow between worlds." That evening, the band gathered for a ceremony honoring those they'd lost. Sarah sat with the women, Morningstar sleeping in her arms, as drums echoed off the canyon walls. The stories told were in Comanche, but she understood enough now to follow along. Tales of bravery, of sacrifice, of love that transcended death. When the formal ceremony ended, the elder's widow approached Sarah. Blue Shawl Woman had barely spoken to her since they'd arrived, grief making her distant. Now she carried something wrapped in soft leather. "My husband, he saw something in you," she said in careful English. "Before he died, he told me, if the white woman survives, if she proves herself, give her this." Sarah unwrapped the bundle carefully. Inside lay a necklace of blue beads and silver, beautiful in its simplicity. But more than that, she recognized its significance. Such items were worn by married women of the band. "I cannot," Sarah protested. "I'm not. Ahiga and I aren't. You think we are blind?" Blue Shawl Woman's weathered face cracked into the first smile Sarah had seen from her. "You carry his child in your arms, his name in your heart. The ceremony is just wind and words. The truth is what matters." As if summoned by his name, Ahiga appeared at the edge of the firelight. His eyes found Sarah's across the gathering, a question in them. Blue Shawl Woman made a dismissive gesture. "Go, talk under stars like young people do. I'll watch the baby." Sarah transferred the sleeping Morningstar to the older woman's experienced arms, then followed Ahiga away from the fire. They walked in comfortable silence to a flat rock overlooking the valley, their secret place for stolen conversations. "Blue Shawl Woman gave me this," Sarah said, showing him the necklace. Ahiga's breath caught. "She has no right, doesn't she?" Sarah turned to face him fully. "Ahiga, we've been dancing around this for moons now. I left everything for you. I fought for your people, became one of them. I'm raising a child with you. But still you hold back. Why?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Then, because you deserve better than a scarred warrior who brings death wherever he goes. Because somewhere out there is a white man's world where you could be safe, respected, have a real home." "I had a home," Sarah interrupted. "It burned. I had safety. It was a cage. I had respect. It came with conditions I couldn't meet." She stepped closer, close enough to see the war between hope and fear in his eyes. "I don't want what I had. I want what I chose. Sarah, my name is Sarah Dakota," she said firmly. "I've earned it. And if you don't want me, say so plainly. But don't hide behind noble words about what I deserve. Let me choose." The moon emerged from behind clouds, bathing them both in silver light. Ahiga reached out slowly, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with such tenderness it made her heart ache. "Every morning, I wake afraid you'll realize your mistake," he admitted. "That you'll see clearly what you've sacrificed for a man who can offer only hardship and running. And every morning, I wake grateful to be alive," Sarah countered. "To have purpose, family, love, yes, love. I'm not afraid to say it anymore." He pulled her against him then, and their lips met under the vast western sky. It was a kiss that tasted of tears and promises, of paths that couldn't be unwalked and choices that defined souls. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Ahiga rested his forehead against hers. "In my people's way, speaking intentions under stars is binding as any ceremony," he said softly. "Will you be my wife? Sarah Dakota, mother to my daughter, partner in whatever trails we must ride?" "I already am," she whispered. "But yes, always yes." He fastened the necklace around her throat with shaking hands. The beads were cool against her skin, but they seemed to carry the warmth of acceptance, of belonging. When they returned to camp, Singing Dove took one look at them and ululated, a sound of joy that brought others running. Blue Shawl Woman smiled knowingly, passing Morning Star back to Sarah's arms. "Now you are complete," she said simply. That night, in the teepee they would now openly share. Sarah lay beside Ahiga with Morning Star between them. The baby had her mother's nose, but was already showing the stubborn set to her jaw that she'd somehow inherited from her adopted parents. "Do you ever regret?" Ahiga asked in the darkness. "The life you might have had?" Sarah thought of her old cabin, of days spent in solitary grief, of a future that had stretched empty and purposeless before her. Then she looked at the man beside her, scarred and gentle, fierce and tender. She felt the warm weight of the child they were raising, heard the soft breathing of the tribe that had become family. "I regret nothing," she said, and meant it, "except maybe not finding you sooner." He laughed softly, that rare sound she treasured. "Then the spirits knew better than us, everything in its time." Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, and another answered. The sound that once would have frightened her now seemed like a blessing. Wild things calling to their mates, claiming their territory, living free despite all who would cage them. Sarah drifted towards sleep, Ahiga's hand warm in hers. Morning Star's tiny fingers wrapped around her thumb. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The soldiers hadn't given up hunting them. Winter was coming. The old ways of life grew harder to maintain each passing season. But tonight, in this hidden valley under ancient stars, they were together. A white woman who'd chosen a red man's world, a warrior who'd found peace in unexpected love, a child who would grow up bridging two cultures, carrying the best of both in her heart. It wasn't the life Sarah Mackenzie had planned, dreamed of, or thought possible. It was harder, more dangerous, more uncertain than anything she'd imagined. It was also more beautiful, more real, more worth living than she'd ever dared hope. As sleep finally took her, Sarah touched the beads at her throat and smiled. She'd been given many names in her life: daughter, wife, widow, traitor. But here in the shelter of Ahiga's arms, she was simply Sarah Dakota, and that was exactly who she was meant to be. The stars wheeled overhead, eternal witnesses to love that crossed all boundaries. In the morning, they would rise and face whatever came. But they would face it together, bound by choice and chance, by bullets and babies, by all the strange turnings that had brought a lonely widow and a wounded warrior to this moment of perfect peace. Their story was far from over. But this chapter, the one written in rescue and fire, in flight and choice, in the courage to love against all odds, this chapter was complete, and it was beautiful. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale from. Please share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and let us know what touched your heart in this story of love conquering all boundaries.